Hi, everybody. Welcome to the sermon recording for Sunday, the 13th of September 2020. It's really lovely to be able to reach out to you in this way across the miles. Let's start by praying together. Let us come to the God who knows us, to the God who created our being, to the God who knows how frail we are, to the God who loves and cherishes us beyond measure. Come as you are and worship God. Teach us, O God, how to treat you, how to know you, how to love you, how to learn of you, how to do as you would have us do. Teach us above all how to show those same things to those around us and those whose lives meet ours, those who rub alongside us each day and those who flit briefly by. Amen. Our first reading today carries on from where we left off last week. If you remember, we were in the middle of Matthew 18. We're going to carry on with that now. We're going to come to the end of the chapter. So I'm going to start reading from verse 21 in Matthew 18. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, Not 7 times, I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he couldn't pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves, who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, Pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves heard what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Do you like maths? In our reading today, there's lots of maths, lots of numbers. And like every word that comes out of Jesus' mouth, it's worth us paying attention to these numbers. And don't worry if maths wasn't your favourite subject in school. The point of the parable is to learn about forgiveness. It's not a maths test. The first number that we come across in our parable is the number 7. Peter asked Jesus, How many times must I forgive my friend when he sins against me or she sins against me? As many as 7 times? Now, why do you think Peter asks this question? Well, remember what's come just before the bit we read today. It was our text last week. And if you remember, last week, Jesus was talking about how important it is to face problems when they arise between people in a church. Not to ignore them, not to push them out under the carpet, but to confront the problem, to bring the two people who've fallen out together and to really work hard time and time and time again in different ways to try to sort out the problem, because the problem could tear the community apart if we don't manage reconciliation between those two people. And so I guess Peter had listened to Jesus saying this, and he must have gone away and started thinking about it. And maybe he thought, I wonder whether if Andrew or John or James upset me, and then they upset me again, and they upset me again, surely Jesus doesn't expect me just to keep on forgiving them, does he? Surely there must be a limit somewhere. Do you think maybe 7 times? Would that be reasonable? So what's the significance of this number 7 here? Well, the first thing we need to know is that the Jewish rabbis, the Jewish teachers, had already considered this question of how many times you should forgive the same person if they sinned against you repeatedly. And they'd come to the conclusion, most of them, the general consensus was that 3 times was the limit. The others said 3 was too many, but there was a kind of general consensus that 3 times was the number of times you should forgive someone. Then after that, it was too late. They'd gone too far. So already by saying that we should forgive somebody 7 times, Peter is going beyond what the religious leaders were teaching at the time. And of course, you may be aware that in the Hebrew mindset, the number 7 represented fullness, perfection. But even that's not enough for Jesus. And Jesus takes that number 7 and he starts playing with it. He says, not just 7 times, but 7 times 70 or 77 times. It's not quite clear in the Greek which one he says, whether he says 77 times or whether he says 7 times 70 times, which would be 490. But you know, if we start to worry about whether we should forgive somebody a maximum of 77 times or a maximum of 490 times, oh dear, we've missed the point already. Because actually what Jesus is saying, there is no limit. There is no limit to the number of times which we should forgive somebody. And in order to explain this, Jesus tells us a parable, a story. And once again, it's a story that's full of numbers. And the story begins with a slave who owes a debt to a king. How big was the debt which the slave owed? Well, in our translation, Jesus says he owed him 10,000 talents. But that doesn't really convey how enormous this debt was. The Greek word, which Jesus uses there to convey the idea of 10,000, is the word that we normally translate in English as myriad. Now, myriad is actually the Greek word which Jesus uses. And as you know, a myriad is a lot, a very great lot. And in fact, this word, myriad or 10,000, was the biggest number in the Greek language. The Greeks didn't have a word for a number bigger than 10,000. So 10,000 was the highest you can get. And so it's a little bit like the word zillion today. There isn't actually a specific meaning for the number zillion. You couldn't write it down with so many zeros. It just means a huge number. The biggest number you can imagine maybe is a zillion. And so when Jesus says that the slave owed the king 10,000 talents, a myriad of talents, it's easier perhaps to think that the slave owed the king a zillion talents, the biggest number you can imagine. And what was a talent? Well, the talent was the largest unit of currency in those days. Today, the largest unit of currency in general circulation is the £50 note, isn't it? But you may or may not be aware that the Bank of England also produces giant notes and Titan notes. A giant note is a paper note worth £1,000,000, and a Titan note is a paper note worth £100,000,000. They are not in general circulation. Apparently there's only about 40 of them, and they're securely locked up in the vault in the Bank of England. They're only used for internal purposes. But it's interesting to know about them, because maybe if Jesus was talking English today, he would have said that that slave owed the king a zillion giants, or a zillion £1,000,000 notes, or even a zillion titans, a zillion £100,000,000 notes. In those days, as I said, a talent was the biggest unit of currency that existed, and a talent actually weighed 30 kilograms of silver. Right, that's about half my weight in silver. That's how much one talent was. And you would have to work, if you were a manual worker, manual labourer, you would have to work for about 6,000 days. That's about 20 years in order to earn a talent of silver. But Jesus is saying that the slave owed the king 10,000 talents. In other words, he owed him a salary of 200,000 years. And so what he's really saying is that the debt was just impossible to repay. It was huge. It was beyond imagining. No man or woman could possibly earn enough in their lifetime to pay it off. And when the slave sees the consequences of his debt, not just prison for himself, but also for his whole family, he despairs. He knows he can't pay this debt back. He throws himself at the feet of his master and he begs for mercy. And something incredible happens. The master releases him from the debt. He forgives his debt. But unfortunately, that slave doesn't really learn the lesson. He doesn't learn the lesson of kindness and generosity that his master was trying to teach him and to demonstrate to him. Because when that same slave leaves the master's presence, he bumps into another slave. Slave number 2, let's call him for clarity. And slave number 2 owes slave number 1 money. Now remember, slave number 1 owed the king 10,000 talents. But slave number 2 only owes slave number 1 a very small amount of money. He owes him 100 denarii. Now, a denarius was the amount of money you'd get for 1 day's wages. So whereas slave number 1 had owed the king 200,000 years worth of salary, slave number 2 owed slave number 1 100 days of salary, not even 1 year, a third of the year. And so you see it's much, much smaller than the debt that slave number 1 has just had pardoned. But slave number 1 doesn't care. He refuses to forgive that debt, even though he's just had this massive generosity shown to him by the king. And of course we know that when the other slaves find out, they're really indignant and they go and tell the king, and in the end, slave number 1 gets his comeuppance, and we all like a good story where the baddie is punished in the end. Jesus' story to Peter and to you and me today is very simple. Through Jesus Christ, God has forgiven the enormous debt that you and I owed. Our sin, our selfishness, our lies, all of our weaknesses. They've gone through God's grace, and we are free, like slave number 1 in the story. So, says Jesus to Peter, why are you asking how often you should forgive somebody else? What a silly question. God has forgiven everything that you've done. You should forgive other people as often as necessary. You probably have heard people talk about Jesus' golden rule, which is treat one another as you would like to be treated yourself. We all want to be forgiven by other people. And we have, through Jesus Christ, a free and full forgiveness. And so you and I should follow that golden rule and treat other people as you and I want to be treated. We should forgive others. Every time somebody sins against me, every time somebody upsets me or hurts me, it turns out that I have a choice. I can choose to treat the person as they have treated me. I can choose to pay back like for like. Anger with anger, violence with violence, pain with pain. Or I can choose the other option, option 2. And Jesus says that option 2 is the only option which is open to his followers. In option 2, instead of treating other people as they have treated us, we treat other people as God has treated us. That is, with forgiveness. Now, perhaps you're asking, what about the man who abuses his wife, for instance? Or the mother who abuses her children? Is Jesus really saying that the woman, the wife, or the child have to just accept that situation? Just suffer the abuse? Of course he isn't. We need to remember that this parable doesn't ask why the slave was in such a huge debt. It doesn't investigate the behavior of the slave that led him to get into such trouble. It says nothing about that. But elsewhere in the Bible, Jesus and other parts of the Bible are crystal clear in condemning those who abuse others, those who exploit others, those who cause suffering, those who cause pain. But here, Jesus is concentrating on those who have been hurt, who have been abused, who have received the violence and the pain. That's what he's talking about here. He doesn't say that they should just accept it and put up with it. Everybody who suffers at the hands of somebody else must defend themselves and try and sort the situation out. But Jesus does say that we all need to forgive those who sin against us. Not to accept the situation, but to forgive those who are causing it. There's a famous story of 2 men who had been imprisoned during a war by the enemies of their state. The war ended, they were released from prison, and several years later the 2 prisoners of war met up. And one of them said to the other, "Have you forgiven our guards yet?" And the second one said, "No, I can never forgive them." And the first one said, "Oh, I see. So you're still in prison then?" When we forgive someone, we're not saying that whatever they did was right. We're not saying that whatever they did doesn't matter. Sometimes it matters very much. We're not saying that we're going to forget what they did to us, forget the pain. Because sometimes that's quite frankly impossible. But we are saying that we refuse to treat them with hatred or revenge. Instead of treating them as they have treated us, we choose to treat them as God has treated us. And we've got another reading today to listen to, and this also illustrates the point of forgiveness, and it comes from Genesis chapter 50, right at the beginning of the Bible. And it's a story where we encounter Joseph and his brothers. Now, I don't know how much you know or you remember of the story of Joseph. Maybe you've watched Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. But Joseph's brothers had betrayed him, and sold him as a slave. But now, after a very long story, the balance of power has changed, and it's Joseph who's the powerful one. He's a powerful man in Egypt, and his brothers are coming to him to ask for forgiveness for everything that they did to him. And they're a bit worried because their dad has died. And they're worried that now that their dad has died, Joseph will take this opportunity to revenge himself on them. So they kind of make up a little story. They say, oh, Daddy said that you should forgive us. Please, don't harm us. Here's the story. Listen to it. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? So they approached Joseph, saying, your father gave us this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him and said, we're here as your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he's doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. I think there are at least two really important things to note from that story of forgiveness. The first is this. Joseph could have chosen to take revenge. He could. Nothing was stopping him. He was a really powerful man. But instead he says, who am I to stand in God's place? Who am I to behave like God? In other words, Joseph is acknowledging that only God has the right to withhold forgiveness. Only God. We, because we have been forgiven by God, we haven't got that right. We need to forgive others. And so Joseph could have chosen to treat his brothers as they treated him. But instead, he chose to treat his brothers as God had treated him, with forgiveness. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is this. It says in verse 17, Joseph wept as they spoke to him. Joseph wept. And I think I just want to finish with this because I want to acknowledge that forgiveness and reconciliation are not easy. They're very, very difficult. And the sad truth of the matter is that forgiveness never comes without some sort of weeping. It always comes at a cost. It's a costly thing to do. It was costly for God because he gave his son, Jesus, in order that you and I might gain that forgiveness. And it's costly for me and you. But the alternative, as is clear from the story of the prisoners of war, is imprisonment. Imprisonment in the cage of our own anger and our own fear and our own desire for revenge. And so, next time somebody offends you, next time somebody hurts you, remember, you've got a choice. You can choose to treat them as they have treated you, or you can choose to treat them as God has treated you. Let's pray. Forgiving God, more willing to forgive than often we are to confess. Help us to see our failings, to see where we fall short, to see where we deceive ourselves, where we close our eyes and ears to the ripples of our wrongdoing. May we breathe in the reality of our actions, the need to change, the depth of our unworthiness. We come before you seeking forgiveness. Now let us breathe in the power of your forgiveness, that we may forgive as you have forgiven us. Amen.